How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 17th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the 5th chapter of Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject, titled The Subject and the Other's Desire. Our main focus last time was on what the subject is not. We did this primarily by inverting Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum. Like last time, this section is quite long and has too many subchapters to state them all here, so instead, I'm just going to name them as I go. There will be timestamps for each in the description. I apologize in advance if this isn't quite clear. This is one of the most theoretically dense chapters in the entire book. If you all don't get anything, please let me know in the comments and I'll try to clear it up. Starting off, Fink goes over what we covered in the first episode of the series, notably how language, or rather the big other as language, alienates us. Essentially, it flows in through the discourse that surrounds us everywhere as children and infants, and, being handed down to us from people around us, it acts as an insidious force, shaping our thoughts and fantasies in a way foreign to us. In Fink's own words, though,
without language there would be no desire as we know it. Exhilarating and yet contorted, contradictory and loath to be satisfied. Nor would there be any subject as such.
His goal in this chapter is to explore just that, to outline Lacan's understanding of a subject in more technical terms than before. The first subchapter of this endeavor is titled Alienation and Separation. Fink begins by taking what we were talking about just a little bit earlier and expanding on it. In Lacan's conception of alienation, he says, there are always two parties involved, the young child and the other in the form of language. These are necessarily unequal, the other almost always winning out over the child. He demonstrates this with this diagram. It's important to note, though, that alienation isn't all a completely bad thing, though, Fink states. Like we were saying just before, the child submitting to the other also gains subjectivity. Without language, there wouldn't be any subject as such. Take this diagram. By submitting, the alienated or rather split subject, as represented by the barred S, disappears beneath or behind a signifier, essentially a representation of a subject, which is notated as S in Lacanian algebra. However, this operation doesn't always have to occur. Sometimes the child wins out, avoiding being split by the other. This isn't necessarily a good thing though, as this is what results in psychosis. In a way, there is actually a choice that presents itself to the child, although it's unconscious and basically forced. They can either choose to give in and become barred, or refuse and foreclose the possibility of becoming a subject. As Fink summarizes,
the choice of submission is necessary if one is to come to be as a subject, but it maintains its status as a choice, since it is nevertheless possible to refuse subjectivity.
He moves on now to separation. This process is much like alienation, but involves the big other as desire, rather than as language. The process begins even before the child is born, its physical presence in the world being a result of some kind of desire for something, be it pleasure, love, power, revenge, or even immortality on the part of its parents. Whatever the motive, these desires continue on even when the child is born, largely responsible for how they enter into language. This is why Lacan states that the subject is caused by the other's desire. Put simply, separation is what arises from this operation. It occurs when the split subject tries to grapple with that desire of the other. For a little aside on what he means by desire, Fink says it's ultimately the desire for something else. As Slavoj Žižek always says, you don't want what you say you do. Rather, you desire desiring itself. How this impacts the child is that the parental other's desire is always in movement, always shifting. Thus, it has to come to terms with the reality of its situation, that it isn't the only thing its parents want. It's almost impossible to have a perfect unity between the child and its parents, a hard pill to swallow. Ending the section, Fink says this.
The child's unsuccessful attempt to perfectly complement its mother leads to an expulsion of the subject from the position of wanting to be, and yet failing to be, the other's sole object of desire.
This subchapter is now titled The Vel of Alienation, And that's just what it's about. A vel, or well as the Romans would have called it, refers to an exclusive choice between two different things. Exclusive because it's impossible to keep two terms at the same time. Lacan saw it slightly differently though. For him, a vel refers to a situation where one party is impossible to maintain in all cases. It's therefore something of a forced choice. He shows this with the story of a mugging. When the robber states your money or your money is already gone. Either you hand over the cash, or the robber picks it off your dead corpse. In the case of alienation, the two units that make up the vel are the other and the subject, with the latter taking the position of the money in our last example. Although alienation is what allows for subjectivity in the first place, it also causes its almost immediate disappearance. This connects to the notion of manque à être, or the want to be. Essentially, the subject isn't able to come forth as a specific thing, as something. The subject itself has no being. Instead, all it does is exist, insofar as it's been taken out of nothingness by the ability to talk about it. If you remember from last episode, almost everything that can be discussed falls under reality to Lacan. What's important to note is that prior to alienation, there is no idea of a subject whatsoever. However, afterwards, in Fink's words,
alienation gives rise to a pure possibility of being, a place where one might expect to find a subject, but which nevertheless remains empty.
In other words, it engenders a place where something is clearly lacking. Lack as a concept is one of Lacan's most interesting, to me personally at least. Essentially, it's the first step beyond nothingness. The metaphor Lacan uses to explain lack is of something being out of place, in other words, of something missing. Before something goes out of place, it first needs to have been localized, given a place. In the case of a subject, this place is inside a symbolic structure, represented with this diagram. Turning now back to alienation, Fink gives this definition of the concept.
Alienation represents the instituting of the symbolic order, which must be realized anew for each subject, and the subject's assignation of a place therein.
It isn't a place that's filled as of yet. Instead, it's one dedicated to the subject. What Fink means when he says that the subject slips behind or below the signifier, what he's referring to is that, as we become subsumed by language, all that's left of a subject is the residue left in the form of a placeholder in the symbolic order. Borrowing now from mathematics and the Lacanian scholar J.A. Miller, Fink likens alienation to the production of the subject as an empty set, one devoid of any elements. This set, although it doesn't contain anything, turns nothing into something simply by marking or representing it. Similarly, despite lacking any materiality, the signifier is what marks out and founds the subject. It wrestles existence from the real, to borrow Lacan's turn of phrase. To put this in more concrete terms, think of a proper name as the signifier. This signifier is built on nothing concrete. It was likely even chosen long before the child it designates was born. Originally, it probably means nothing to the child. However, before long, it becomes inextricably intertwined with its understanding of its own subjectivity. In this way, the name as a signifier, although built on absence, stands in for the child's subject. This takes us to the next subchapter, desire and lack in separation. Here, his concern is with taking another look at separation, and at developing some of the ideas he went over earlier. He starts out by summarizing what we've just learnt about alienation.
Alienation is characterized by a forced choice, which rules out being for the subject, instituting instead the symbolic order and relegating the subject to mere existence as a placeholder therein.
This false choice that leads to the disappearance of being is the Vel of Alienation. It's in contrast to how separation works, which Lacan sees as giving rise to being, be it only momentarily. An essential idea behind separation is the notion of juxtaposition, the overlap of two different lacks. For separation to occur, the parental other must show that it itself is lacking, in other words, that it's incomplete. Separation begins with the subject, through alienation, lodging its want to be in this so-called barred other. It's barred because it too is split between consciousness and unconscious desires that it isn't aware of, which are often contradictory, ambiguous, and always in constant flux. What happens in this lodging of the want to be is the child attempts to overlap or connect its lack with that of the others. It tries to figure out what its parents want, and to fill that space. As an aside, this is why Lacan says man's desire is the desire of the other. We learn to desire from a vantage point of those around us. Bringing us into the next subchapter, the introduction of a third term, we can see that this operation is, at the end of the day, doomed for failure. Due to desire's slippery contradictory nature, it's impossible for the child to completely monopolize it in the other. Summarizing this, Fink says,
Separation may be seen here as involving an attempt by the subject to make these two lacks thoroughly coincide, that attempt being abruptly thwarted.
We can understand this concept through an analysis of Lacan's reconceptualization of psychosis in Seminar 3 and his essay on a question preliminary to any possible treatment of psychosis, where Fink says the notion of a so-called paternal function plays out similarly to that of separation. Psychosis, in the eyes of Lacan, comes about through a child failing to assimilate what he calls a primordial signifier that structures its symbolic universe. A psychotic child might be able to assimilate language, but unlike what Lacan classifies as neurotic children, it can't come to be in it. The primordial signifier is a sort of anchoring point, without which all other signifiers drift aimlessly. How the signifier is instituted in the child is through the aforementioned paternal function. Take the nuclear family as an example. Let's imagine there's a moment where the child and the mother are unified. At this stage in time, the child is nothing more than a bundle of sensations, without a sense of ego. It still isn't yet differentiated from the mother, instead viewing her as an extension of itself. This is all changed by the function, where a third term, the father, or more accurately as we soon see, the nom du père, or name of the father, intervenes in their relationship, triangulating it. What annuls the child-mother relationship is that the third term shows to the child that they aren't the sole object of the other's, or rather, the capital O mother's, desire. The reason why this is described by Lacan as a function, or in the case of the nom du père, a name, is to underline that it isn't at all connected to biological fathers, but rather what takes the role often socially assigned to them. For example, the name can be a different family member or some interest of the mother's. In the case of Little Hans, one of Freud's patients who had equinophobia, the name of her father was a horse of all things, standing in for his real father who was unable to separate the child from the mother himself. Another aspect of the paternal function is what's called the reality principle in Freudian thought. Essentially, as we went over in episode 3 of the series, the symbolic order acts to cancel out and transform the real into a socially understandable reality, even if it isn't necessarily socially acceptable. A side effect of this operation is that the child is severed from the pleasure of a mother-child unity, and it must therefore redirect its search for pleasure in directions more agreeable to the figures of the father and the mother, whoever may hold those positions. This reality principle doesn't negate the pleasure principle, the search for immediate pleasure, but rather redirects it. The main goal of the paternal function, however, is to cause the assimilation of a name by the child, which neutralizes the other's desire. This is because the other's desire has the potential to be seriously damaging to the child. In Lacan's words,
"The mother is a big crocodile, and you find yourself in her mouth. You never know what may set her off suddenly, making those jaws clamp down. That is the mother's desire."
the reason why the paternal function is important is because it produces something of a roller that holds the jaws of the trap open, the substitution of the name for the mother's desire, as it were, represented by this diagram. This substitution is only made possible by language, which requires the name of a father to act as a quote-unquote second signifier, represented as S2 in Lacanian algebra, which retroactively designates the mother's desire as a first one, marked with S1, as seen in this diagram. The role of S2 is very specific. It symbolizes the desire of the mother and transforms it into signifiers. By doing so, as Fink says,
it creates a rift in the mother-child unity and allows the child a space in which to breathe easy, a space of its own.
The end result of the substitution, which Fink and Lacan call a metaphor, is the advent of the subject as subject. No longer is the subject just an empty placeholder, rather it is, at this point, one that is capable of desiring. Separation's end result is the expulsion of the child from the other. Just as in Freud, the father's threats of castration have the effect of dividing the mother and the child in the conclusion of the Oedipus complex, represented with this. This brings us to the next subchapter, Object A, the other's desire. He starts by reformulating what we originally glossed as man's desire is the desire of the other, translating it into this.
Man's desire is for the other to desire him.
This reveals the other's desire to be one and the same with what Lacan terms objet petit a, desire's cause in the individual. The child wants to be the sole object of their mother's desire, but it simply can't. There's always something that escapes it, some desire that goes beyond the child, what we discussed just now with this section on separation. In a way, objet petit a can be thought of as a remainder of a child-mother union falling apart, the very last trace of unity. The barred subject, in order to sustain the illusion that it is whole, clings onto this remainder, resulting in what Lacan calls fantasy, marked with this matheme, which ought to be read as the divided subject in relation to objet petit a. In Fink's words,
it is a subject's complex relationship to object A that he or she achieves a phantasmatic sense of wholeness, completeness, fulfillment, and well-being.
And Lysan's recounting their fantasies to their analyst informed them on what or how they want to be positioned in relation to this cause of desire. Objet petit a is almost like a plaything for the subject, who fills with it as they please in the fantasy scenario as a way to achieve maximum excitement. However, this excitement can quickly turn into disgust or even horror, since what is most exciting isn't necessarily what is most pleasurable. In French, Lacan terms this jouissance, a word that's also used by almost all his translators, the English translation of pleasure being woefully limited. As this jouissance comes to substitute for the last unity of the mother and child, we can imagine another jouissance which preceded its dissolution. To show this, Fink uses this graphic. Please forgive the dark void consuming it. The excitement of the first connection gives way under the paternal function, only for a remainder to be left afterwards, recuperated in fantasy. This fantasy is also what allows the subject to go beyond its nothingness on the level of the symbolic, to gain some sort of semblance of being in the real, all made possible by firstly alienation and then separation. Ending this section, he summarizes what we've just gone over, adding on that separation is what splits the subject into the ego and the unconscious, and the corresponding split of the other into the lacking other, marked with a barred A, and objet petit a. In his words,
separation results in a kind of intersection whereby the other's desire that the subject considers his or her own is ripped away from the other and retained by the now divided subject in fantasy.
He represents this using this diagram, where you can see the subject and the other divided. With this, we get to the third to last section of the entire chapter, titled simply, A Further Separation, the Traversing of Fantasy. It must be noted now that the idea of separation in Lacan essentially disappeared in the 60s, eventually coming to fall under the term alienation as well. However, another concept popped up in its place, that of traversing the fantasy. This concept began with Lacan's elaboration on the idea that the analyst should play the role of objet petit a, rather than as the other, a position they are often placed in by analysans, who see them, first of all, almost as the all-knowing judges of their character. The main thing at stake here is identification. Whereas many Anglo-American psychoanalysts, following the path set out by Sigmund Freud's daughter Anna Freud, saw the patient's identification with their own, that is, the analyst's ego, as a method for treating neurosis, Lacanian saw it as a trap. Instead, all they have to do is give as few references to their likes and dislikes, their hopes and dreams, and so on, as possible. They must act as a figure of mysterious desire, not as something for identification to be introjected from. This is to essentially shake up the analysand's relationship with objet pétia and fantasy, the analyst maintaining an enigmatic desire for something else unknown. What this reconfiguration of fantasy implies is a multitude of different things. Firstly, there's the creation of a fundamental fantasy during the course of analysis, which underlines all other fantasies and is what most profoundly connects the subject to the other's desire. Then there's, in his words,
a crossing over of positions within the fundamental fantasy, whereby the divided subject assumes the place of the cause, in other words, the traumatic cause of his or her own advent as subject.
This occurs when the subject takes the place of where the other's desire was, represented by this diagram. This idea of becoming one's own cause may seem very paradoxical, but Lacan and by consequence Fink mean is that the subject takes responsibility. The defined cause brought about by the other is internalized. This is connected closely to trauma, since trauma, as evidenced by many of Freud's case studies, acts as the force behind the child's advent of subjectivity. The encounter with the other's desire is by its nature a traumatic experience, where jouissance is experienced. Ending the section, Fink says,
the traversing of fantasy is the process by which the subject subjectifies trauma, takes a traumatic bent upon him or herself, and assumes responsibility for that jouissance.
We now find ourselves at the penultimate section, Subjectifying the Cause, a temporal conundrum. The focus here is how Lacan never exactly pinpoints where the subject chronologically enters the scene. It's always just about to arrive or will have already arrived, somewhat similar to Gilles Deleuze's concept of ion in a way. The main point is that this way of viewing time of a subject defers action back. Take a look at this diagram, for example. A first event occurs, E1. Burning bears fruit when a second one occurs, E2. The first event is retroactively given signification, for example, of a trauma, marked as T. To give a more concrete example, think of a sentence, by the time you get back, I would have already left. The first event, here my departure, is only retroactively determined as being before your return. Without the second event of the return, it would have no such status. In Fink's words,
it takes two moments to create a before and after. The signification of the first moment changes in accordance with what comes afterwards.
The same general principle holds true for signifiers too. A first signifier can only give rise to the subject after a second one has appeared on the scene, represented with this diagram. To quote again from Fink,
a relation between two signifiers proves to us that a subject has passed that way, and yet we can in no sense pinpoint the subject in either time or space.
He promises to return to this point later on, but now moves on to how the traversing of a fantasy can be thought of as a signifierization of the other's desire, in other words, as turning it into signifiers. Essentially, when the cause is symbolized, the other's desire simultaneously is fully brought into the movement of signifiers, and the subject finally gains access to its signifier, represented in Lacanian algebra with an S next to a barred A in brackets, as seen here. Finally, we're now at the very last section of a chapter, titled Alienation, Separation, and the Traversing of Fantasy in the Analytic Setting. Fink begins by painting an image of an analysand lying on the couch, talking and talking. At some point, the analyst simply interrupts them, repeating back to them a word they mentioned in passing. The point of this is to shock the analysand. They often try to tailor their discourse, trying to figure out what the analyst wants to hear, what will please them. However, by these jolts, these little interruptions, the analyst is able to get the analysand to understand, at least momentarily, that they have no idea what the former actually desires. By doing this, they further place a space between the barred subject and objet pétia, disrupting their phantasmic relationship. Moving on now to separation and alienation, both processes are involved constantly during the analytic situation. For example, when the analyzer alienates themselves in their attempt to communicate coherently through language. This sort of alienation is inevitable, and, unlike in Marxism, not at all condemned by the analyst. Turning now to separation, the analyst's discourse is very different from the alienation of the analysand. Their goal, even when providing some sort of meaning, is to destroy the analysand's notion of the analyst as some sort of all-knowing figure. Fink now begins his ending remarks by giving an overview of the subject.
One is the subject of a particular fate, a fate one has not chosen, but which, however random or accidental it may seem to be at the outset, one must nevertheless subjectify.
There is a toss of a dice at the beginning of everyone's universes, one that creates a split and set structure in motion. All we can do is come to grips with this random toss, based on the configuration of our parents' desires. Now, this concludes the chapter on the subject and the other's desire from Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject. I know this was a bit of a denser and longer video, but I truly hope you enjoyed or at least learned something. If you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at Chapter 6, Metaphor and the Precipitation of Subjectivity. Until next time, bye!